In late August, the Canadian government quietly removed a broad set of retaliatory tariffs on American goods, far more than it publicly acknowledged, sparking questions about trade strategy, political messaging, and the realities of cross-border commerce in a globalized economy. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. The decision, documented in an order in council published online, reveals that, with the notable exception of the steel, aluminum, and automotive sectors, virtually all Canadian counter-tariffs have been lifted. This move appears to contradict Prime Minister Mark Carney's earlier public statements. In August, Carney had promised to remove counter-tariffs, specifically covered under CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico agreement that governs the vast majority of trade across North America. By framing the rollback as a reciprocal response to Washington's trade policies, Carney suggested Canada would engage in a measured, symmetric strategy, matching U.S. tariffs where they applied while safeguarding Canadian interests elsewhere. However, the government's own order in council, released a week after Carney's announcement, shows that even goods not compliant with CUSMA are no longer subject to counter-tariffs. This departure from the official narrative suggests that Canada's trade policy, in practice, is far more lenient than the rhetoric implied. Trade experts say the decision reflects a pragmatic recognition of the limits and costs of counter-tariffs. William Pellerin, an international trade lawyer at Macmillan LLP, described Ottawa's approach as an exercise in bureaucratic restraint. Implementing counter-tariffs is administratively intensive, Pellerin explained. Every shipment of non-CUSMA compliant goods would require customs officers to verify documentation, assess tariffs, and ensure compliance. For many goods, the revenue generated would not justify the enormous administrative burden. Indeed, while tariffs can generate income, in this case the potential gains from non-CUSMA goods were likely marginal. Enforcement would have required additional staffing at the Canada Border Services Agency, as well as monitoring and verification systems that would have cost far more than the revenue collected. From this perspective, the government's decision was not merely a political calculation, it was a logical move to reduce unnecessary administrative complexity while preserving economic efficiency. CUSMA, which replaced NAFTA, governs the majority of goods traded between Canada, the US, and Mexico. Products that qualify under the agreement must meet strict rules of origin, ensuring that a sufficient proportion of the materials and production occur within North America. Exporters must maintain detailed documentation to demonstrate compliance, a process that can be burdensome and costly, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises. By lifting counter-tariffs on non-CUSMA goods, Canada spared both businesses and trade officials the challenge of enforcing a complex system with limited financial benefit. For many firms, the decision represented a significant relief, allowing them to focus on production, logistics, and market competitiveness rather than paperwork and audits. Stephen Tapp, a trade economist at the University of Ottawa, emphasized that the move is consistent with a broader economic strategy. Trade policy isn't just about retaliation. It's about predictability, minimizing friction, and ensuring that cross-border commerce continues to flow smoothly. In that sense, Ottawa's quiet rollback is smart policy, even if it lacks drama. While economists and trade experts view the decision as pragmatic, opposition politicians have seized upon it as evidence of weakness. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre accused Carney of making generous concessions to the United States without extracting meaningful benefits in return. He also mocked Carney's elbows up rhetoric, suggesting that the Prime Minister's public image of toughness does not align with the quiet reality of Canada's trade posture. Negotiating with the U.S. requires both strategy and toughness, Poilievre said. But Ottawa's actions suggest a willingness to concede quietly, without clear benefit for Canadian industries or workers. The optics are sensitive because trade disputes are highly symbolic as well as economic. Tariffs are not merely financial instruments, they are statements of national resolve, signaling to both domestic and international audiences the country's willingness to defend its economic interests. By quietly rolling back counter-tariffs, Canada prioritized practical economic outcomes over symbolic gestures of defiance. Canada-US trade relations have long been marked by periodic disputes, particularly in industries such as softwood lumber, dairy, and steel. During the 1980s and 1990s, counter-tariffs were a common tool used to pressure the United States into concessions, often resulting in high-profile negotiations that drew media attention and public scrutiny. However, In recent decades, the costs of implementing and enforcing broad retaliatory tariffs have grown, both financially and administratively. CUSMA, and before it NAFTA, sought to streamline trade and reduce friction, making retaliatory tariffs increasingly costly and less effective. In this context, Canada's current decision reflects a recognition that rigid tit-for-tat measures may no longer be the optimal strategy for protecting national interests. Canada's economy is heavily intertwined with that of the United States. Roughly 75% of Canadian exports go to the U.S., meaning that any disruption in trade flows can have widespread consequences for employment, industrial output, and regional economies. Tariffs, while politically satisfying in some cases, can create bottlenecks, increase costs for businesses, and lead to retaliatory measures from the other side. By removing counter-tariffs on non-sectoral goods, Ottawa has effectively reduced potential friction, ensuring smoother supply chains and more predictable trade flows. This approach is particularly important for industries reliant on just-in-time production, where delays or added costs can have cascading effects. Implementing counter-tariffs requires significant compliance efforts. Customs officials must verify documentation, ensure proper classification of goods, and manage appeals or disputes. For non-CUSMA compliant goods, these tasks can become extremely cumbersome, especially given the sheer volume of trade between Canada and the U.S. The financial and logistical costs often outweigh the limited revenue generated, making broad counter-tariffs impractical. Pellerin described the decision as an acknowledgement of these realities. From a bureaucratic standpoint, it was simply too costly to enforce counter-tariffs on a broad scale. Ottawa avoided a potential administrative nightmare by exercising restraint. The quiet rollback of counter-tariffs also sends a signal to the U.S. about Canada's negotiating posture. By lifting tariffs quietly, Ottawa may be demonstrating a preference for diplomacy and negotiation over confrontation. At the same time, the move raises questions about how Canada will respond to future U.S. trade measures. Critics worry that perceived leniency could encourage more aggressive demands from Washington in the future. Canada must balance multiple factors: the economic need for smooth trade flows, domestic political pressures, and the long-term goal of maintaining leverage in negotiations. The decision to remove counter-tariffs reflects a careful calibration of these priorities. Industries directly affected by counter-tariffs have mixed reactions. Exporters of consumer goods and manufacturing components benefit from the reduction in administrative burdens and costs, while sectors like steel and aluminum remain exposed, continuing to face tariffs that could affect competitiveness. Agriculture and dairy, traditionally sensitive areas in Canada-US trade, are also watching closely, as policy shifts may affect their access to U.S. markets. Canada's removal of broad counter-tariffs represents more than a policy adjustment; it reflects a strategic, long-term approach to trade in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. By prioritizing efficiency, predictability, and pragmatic outcomes over symbolic gestures, Ottawa is signaling a shift toward measured diplomacy, careful economic calculation, and bureaucratic restraint. Yet the decision carries risks. Critics argue it undermines Canada's negotiating position, while supporters see it as an acknowledgement of the practical realities of modern trade. Either way, the move illustrates the delicate balancing act facing Canadian policymakers: defending national interests, managing international relationships, and navigating the economic realities of cross-border commerce. The story of Canada's counter-tariff rollback is, ultimately, a story about trade in the 21st century, complex, interdependent, and shaped as much by strategic calculation as by political messaging. The quiet nature of this shift may mean that its effects will unfold slowly, but the implications for businesses, policy